this podcast, Jennifer Riel, co-author of Creating Great Choices, talks about making great choices in creating the future of work. So stay tuned. Welcome everyone to Jobs of Future podcast. Today we have with us Jennifer Riel. She's an adjunct professor at the Rotman School of Management, University of Toronto, specializing in creative problem solving. Her focus is on helping everyone from undergraduate students to business executives to create better choices. More of the time. Jennifer is the co-author of Creating Great Choices, a leader's guide to integrative thinking with Roger L. Martin, former dean of Rotman School of Management, based on a decade of teaching and practice with integrative thinking. The book lays out practical methodologies for tackling our most vexing business problems. Using illustrations from organizations like Lego, Vanguard, Unilever, the book shows how individuals can leverage the tension of opposite ideas to create a third, better way forward. An award-winning teacher, Jennifer leads training and integrative thinking, strategy, and innovation at organizations of all types, from small nonprofit to some of the largest companies in the world. With that, Jennifer, welcome to the podcast.
My pleasure. I'm happy to be here.
Beautiful. I think it's intriguing. I think every aspect of that bio, and by the way, thank you so much for picking my request to come on the podcast, because I think we definitely, whenever we get to hear a perspective of a practitioner or at least a researcher about this idea of where we are heading to when it comes to future, I think that's phenomenal. So why don't you walk us through your journey? Like that will be amazing.
So my journey in terms of how I wound up in this room today.
Yes.
Well, I work in a business school, but I'm a little unusual for someone who works in a business school. My original undergrad is in the liberal arts, English literature and history. And when I graduated, I became a creative. So I worked as a copywriter, early days of e-commerce, doing some things online, and really enjoyed it. But then my department was outsourced. And we were sent to work at a studio. It was pretty toxic, a pretty miserable environment. For me, it was a meaningfully worse job. And what's more, I actually thought it was a bad business decision. The way they had negotiated the contract suggested to me that they were going to get roughly the same amount of work for roughly the same amount of money, but there was no quality metric. And so it was going to be worse. And so no one had asked my opinion as a senior copywriter as to whether this was a good business decision. I clearly didn't have the language and the credibility to be taken seriously in that realm. So I decided to do an MBA, and my intention was to learn the secret language, right? What are the handshakes and what's the terminology? And then I could go back into the world of marketing, consumer goods, that general space, and then do a better job, change the world, all those things. When I got here to the Rotman School, I met our then dean, Roger Martin, who, like me, was unconventional. Roger had been a management consultant his whole career. And he was really in the early stages of taking this idea of integrative thinking that we're going to talk about today and take it out into the world. He was trying to figure out how to teach our MBA students here at Rotman what this was and how they could apply it. I was really intrigued. I took a class from him, really enjoyed it. And then when I was graduating, he asked me to stay and work with him for a year to help him figure out how to communicate this in lots and lots of different ways. I think he figured out I was kind of a storyteller. And so asked me to stay and work with him. And that was 12 years ago. So we're still having a lot of fun working on this, on strategy, innovation, a whole bunch of connected disciplines, taking really great theory and then asking, how does someone actually do it in their job? What does that look like, and how can we help them?
Interesting. And what is your role today? Like, what's your current role?
So I wear a couple of hats. I have two here at the Rotman School. So I teach integrative thinking, strategy, and design thinking to undergrad, MBA, and executive audiences. I also have a sort of research role. I'm working in the Martin Prosperity Institute on a project related to the future of work and the future of democratic capitalism. No big deal. It's just a small topic. And then the other half of my time I spend with organizations. So I work with companies, mainly in the United States, on their strategy or on their innovation challenges.
Interesting. So What is Martin Prosperity Institute? I think the name is pretty stark. I think good choice with the name. So what exactly is that? We'll resume after a short break. This part of the podcast is brought to you by First Friday Fair, fastest AI powered way to find your next opportunity. Check out the website firstfridayfair.tao.ai and find your next dream job. Let's get back to the podcast.
So the Martin Prosperity Institute was started a decade ago. It's an independent think tank. So it's part of the University of Toronto, but it's not politically affiliated. So nonpartisan, I guess, would be the terminology. And it is looking at issues of shared prosperity. And there are two dominant themes of our work. The first is led by Richard Florida. Richard is the most famous and important, I guess I would say, urban theorist in the world. He studies cities and does extremely important and exciting work there about how cities change, evolve, and grow. So he does our work around cities. And then Roger and I have been embarked on a project about 5 years ago that is more broadly about democratic capitalism and prosperity. We started to see some storm clouds on the horizon 5 years ago that suggested that shared prosperity wasn't moving forward. And if that's the case, that puts not just companies, but democracy at risk. And I think we've seen some of that play out around the world, not just in the United States over the last couple of years, where people are starting to lose trust in their democratic systems, starting to see work as less than meaningful. It takes more than it gives from our lives. And so we've been studying that question, what's driving the fact that we no longer have our shared prosperity, and how might we think about changing that.
Fascinating. So how is that connected to something called integrative thinking? Like, is that the birth child of this research, or what's your thoughts there?
So we actually think integrative thinking might provide some possible answers. So there are a bunch of places in democratic capitalism where we accept trade-offs. So we say the capital markets need to be the ultimate driver of everything that companies do. And so we have to accept that we are going to be increasingly short-term, only focused on the shareholder. Maximizing shareholder value is the purpose of business. And there are a whole bunch of people who believe that's true. That's the only way to think about organizations. And then you have an emerging group of folks who say that's a recipe for the end of the world. People can't grow forever. It's not possible for us to actually do that. And so we need alternative models that say the purpose of a business is to exist for the long run, to serve its customers, to treat its employees extraordinarily well, so that we're creating a better society. We believe that there is a lot of room between the two extremes to imagine better answers where we grow and get great returns for shareholders appropriately enough, but also make the world a better place. So the hypothesis is that whether it's on the economic side or the democratic side, that there may be answers that are better than the answers we have. Certainly on the democracy side, the Republicans and the Democrats in the States have stopped speaking to each other. We can't even listen at this point. We see similar things in the UK. I think in India, you see similar divides. There are divides around the world where we're moving further apart in ideology. And so are there ways we can think of creating better answers that enable people to engage in different ways?
Interesting. And so what is the impact of this so-called tribalism when it comes to in the productivity of institute? Like what has been your finding, and how it's impacting the future of work? What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think there are many impacts of tribalism. Partly it just makes us more suspicious, more unkind, less willing to work with others. Inside organizations, it produces worse decisions. So let's imagine I work in marketing, you work in finance. We are tribes. And I believe that the way I view the world, which is that the customer is the most important thing and that we need to invest to keep that customer, is the right way of thinking about the business. You, on the other hand, believe that if we do that, we're going to go out of business because we're just going to spend a crazy amount of money trying to satisfy these customers who are always changing their mind. And what tends to happen is that we produce real interpersonal conflict between us. We have factions in the organization that fight each other for resources, for attention, for agreement of the senior leaders, and we're not actually working together. One layer down from that, just the cross-functional team. So let's imagine we put together a group of folks and they are every kind of diverse backgrounds, diverse races, diverse perspectives, diverse genders, everything. That is, I think, almost universally seen to be a good thing. I certainly think it's a good thing to have diversity in the room. The problem is we don't give that group tools to manage, work through, and leverage the diversity. So my observation is what we tend to see is that the loudest voice wins. So we have diversity, but we don't actually get to hear it. We don't actually get to hear all of the perspectives of the person who's quieter, the person who feels less like they can put their voice forward, and those who like to argue, those who speak loudly, those who have political power tend to win, and we don't hear from those quieter voices. So the organization is worse off. We may have blind spots that the loudest voice doesn't recognize. And so we can see organizations struggling to innovate, to grow, in part because they're not doing a very good job of engaging the diverse voices in the room.
Interesting. Pretty awesome, by the way. I think that's pretty awesome. And thank you so much for investing your effort in such a critical area that we will be impacted with this when we are going forward, whether professionally or personally. So I do appreciate your every effort in this. So now let's talk about this fascinating book, right? So creating great choices. So tell us the backstory behind what motivated this book. What's the story to this book?
We'll resume after a short break. This part of the podcast is brought to you by First Friday Fair, fastest AI-powered way to find your next opportunity. Check out the website firstfridayfair.tao.ai and find your next dream job. Let's get back to the podcast.
So, as I said, I started working with Roger Martin 12 years ago. He was just then publishing a book on the subject of integrative thinking. And to sum up what integrative thinking is, essentially, it is the idea that when we are confronted with a tough either or choice, a trade-off between A and B, most of us say, oh, the world is hard, my job is to choose, I'm going to pick the one that is least worst, the one I can live with. And it's not great, it's actually kind of miserable, but what are you going to do? Integrative thinking suggests that you could actually use the tension between the opposing ideas as a platform for innovation. Use the tension to create something new. What would it look like to take what I really value from option A, what I really value from option B, and to build something new? So Roger had had this insight that some of the highly successful leaders he had met and worked with in his career seemed to do this. Most of the rest of us don't. And so in his book, The Opposable Mind, he told stories of Iggy Lafley from Procter & Gamble and Isidore Sharp of the Four Seasons and a number of other great leaders from across industries. And he sort of told the stories of how they had managed to do this. What was the choice they faced and how did they actually overcome and create a new choice? What was not in that book was very much about how you or I could think in this way or use this approach if it didn't come naturally to us. So it turns out A.G. Lafley just thinks this way, whether through his experience or his training or his childhood or I don't know what. This is how he thinks. He likes to hold models in tension and is always looking for a better answer. It's just in his mindset. That's not how I always thought. I sort of wanted to find the right answer very quickly. And once I had that right answer, I was done. I wasn't all that interested in revisiting or pushing forward. And if someone had a different answer, it was unhelpful because it was wrong. I mean, if I have the right answer and you have a different answer, your answer is just wrong, right? So what I wanted to do is work with Roger to figure out what the step-by-step process would be. Is there a recipe? Is there a way that you and I, together in a team, could actually tackle problems where we wished there was a better answer? What would that look like? And so we spent really about a decade honing and refining a process and working with executives, MBA students, educators who work with little kids, all kinds of different groups to figure out what would be the critical steps. How might we actually teach those steps to people? And by the time we reached the end of that decade, we sort of said, it's been 10 years. That's a long time since the publication of the last book. We think we have something new to say. We think that we can put forward a methodology or an approach That even if you hadn't read The Opposable Mind, even if you didn't feel inclined to read it, this could be a book that would help you think differently about the problems in front of you and create better choices more of the time.
Interesting. And so, sure, I think this wonderful thought came and you said, okay, we have to add something new. So now let's talk about the incubation cycle that goes into sort of from an ideation to actually getting a book published. So some of the nuances there, like what like if you can embark on that journey, what you saw.
Sure. So I can tell you a bit about this book, which is an unusual process. I can tell you how it's unusual from others.
Right.
So Roger and I both had a long relationship with Harvard Business Review Press. So we knew the editors there, our great editor, Jeff Keogh, the former editorial director, Tim Sullivan, a number of folks. And so when it came time, we thought we had an idea for a book. We did a very quick book proposal and sent it to Jeff just directly and said, what do you think? He was very excited and enthusiastic. Tim, similarly, very, very positive. And so they said, go write it, take the next 6 months or so, send us a manuscript when you're done. Harvard is an academic publisher, and so they send it out for peer review. The process there is they'll ask you for a couple of folks who might have something interesting to say. They similarly compile a list. They don't tell you who they send it to. It's a blind review process coming back. But essentially, they ask those reviewers, is this person saying something interesting? Does it feel like it's a contribution? And should we publish this book or not? And Harvard, because of their unique position, Harvard Business Review Press, usually asks one academic, one practitioner leader, and then one other person, depending on the set of concepts in the book. So in that case, we sent it out. 2 months later, you get feedback and you get a decision from Harvard saying, yes, we'll publish, or no, we won't. There's a revision process that probably lasted maybe 2 months. So you have time to go back and incorporate all the feedback from the reviewers that makes sense to you. And also, Jeff and Tim sent us similar comments that they thought would be useful. We do that revision, send a new manuscript, and then you go into the traditional stages of publishing. There is a copy edit stage where it's about the flow and making sure that all the sentences make sense. Then there's a proofreading stage, everything's spelled right. And then finally you do a final galley check to make sure that the figures are in the right place and all that sort of stuff. The process is pretty long with that peer review part in it. So from the time we decided to submit the book proposal till the time the book came out, it gets between 18 months to 2 years. It's not a short process. There's a lot of marketing and background stuff that happens after the galleys go in. So the actual publication doesn't typically happen until 3 or 4 months at minimum after you've signed off on the final stuff. So we're unusual in the sense that we had an existing relationship with that publisher. I think oftentimes if you have a book idea, you have to figure out who knows someone, so you can have a warm conversation. Or I don't happen to have an agent because of that existing relationship. Lots of folks find an agent to help them engage with publishers. And then a non-academic publisher would have a different looking process than Harvard Business Review or Stanford or University of California Press or whatever the other publishers might be that are academic in nature.
We'll resume after a short break. This part of the podcast is brought to you by First Friday Fair, fastest AI-powered way to find your next opportunity. Check out the website firstfridayfair.tao.ai and find your next dream job. Let's get back to the podcast.
Interesting. Thank you so much for walking us through that. I think other thing that I find from my background in authoring a book. So there has been a time where there are some aha moment that you recollect looking back in your writing journey, that you were thinking, okay, this book will come out in this way. And then once you start writing and you say, hey, wow, I never realized that I have a lot more to say in that particular segment that I anticipated. What has been your aha moment in writing great choices?
So it's interesting because the development of the theory took so long. The actual writing was really short. I think we wrote the bulk of the manuscript in 6 or 7 weeks because it was all sort of in our heads already. So most of the ahas came through the development of the theory. There were moments where we learned something we thought was working really well and helping people to push to solve problems differently could be changed, shifted. We could think about it differently. A lot of that happened over the period of 10 years. And so when we sat down to write, it was more getting that out on paper. So there were, I think, fewer ahas during the writing process.
Interesting. And what about in your decade journey, right? What are some of the things that were sort of big surprises in your sort of perception of what could be a way to resolve this conflict and sort of getting to an answer vis-a-vis what you actually end up finding as a solution? Like, do you have some recollection of some of those cases that you saw? Wow, like we were thinking it in a different direction, but it ended up becoming a different one.
There were, I think, two huge surprises to me along the way. The first is who. The first relates to who can do it. So we've been teaching integrative thinking in the MBA program and in our undergraduate commerce program to some executives for about 4 years or so. And we had a student from the MBA program come back to us and say, it's amazing that you're doing this for pretty privileged, pretty high achieving 30-year-olds. MBAs and then executives who are even higher achieving and even more privileged and even older. If this really is a helpful and productive way to help people solve their problems, and it pushes back on a lot of conventional education that says, find the right answer, defend it at all costs, aren't we leaving it a bit late? Like, shouldn't we start earlier? Couldn't we do this to high school kids and see if it helps them make better decisions? And so we said, well, let's go try it. And it was a young woman named Ellie Avishai, who's a graduate, and she started an I Think initiative, they called it, to teach this to kids. Before long, we figured out that educators were really the people we needed to teach, and then they could teach the kids, because that's how you get scale. So what has been surprising to me about the who is I expected that there would be a gradation of quality, that the younger the kids were, the less thoughtful, sophisticated, and rich their solutions would be, and that the older you got through your life, you would just increasingly have a greater ability to think rigorously and critically, to leverage the insights from your experience and from this discussion, and then create better answers. It turned out not to be the case. It turns out that little kids are amazing at this. They naturally see it as a thing worth doing. Why can't I create a better answer? I'd love to create a better answer. Let's do it. Let's figure it out. And they do kinds of work on challenges. So there's a grade 2 teacher who had a teacher come in and say, a parent rather, come in and say, I understand when the kids were out at recess, they brought some snails back into the classroom, and that's animal cruelty and you shouldn't do it. And so she had the kids engage in an integrative thinking conversation, one model on one extreme, snails belong in nature, and the other model on the other extreme are snails belong in the classroom because they can help us learn. And what's the better answer between those two things, with 7-year-olds. And they engage, they're excited, they're interested all the way through high school. They do an amazing job, particularly if you give them a problem they care about and that feels meaningful to them. There's actually a little bit of a dip in some cases at the MBA level. I love our MBA students. I think that they are great and exciting people. But there is something that happens around the age of 28 or 30 with 5 years of work experience where you're probably at the height of your arrogance about how good you are. Like, you've done very well up to that point in your career, and you haven't yet hit that point where it becomes really clear how hard leadership actually is, leading other people. Just how much of your job is going to be less about your technical skills and more about how you help other people succeed. And so they struggle sometimes with even seeing this as worth doing. They do want the right answer and they want the A so they can get the great investment banking job. And then it increases again for executives. Executives, especially at the most senior levels of organizations, know that their entire job boils down to creating strategy and leading people. And integrative thinking is useful in both of those realms.
Interesting. So, if we go slightly deeper into creating great choices construct, right? So, what is it? What is an anatomy of a great choice? Like, what really constitutes a great choice? Like, what are some of the indicators or some of the fabric or ingredients of a great choice?
And there is no single definition, because choices, particularly in the management sphere, are subjective, right? What is a great choice to me may not look and feel like a great choice to you. There are many different ways to win. Different organizations choose to prioritize different things. And so when we talk about creating great choices, we are talking about it from your own perspective. So you are creating an answer that is better than what you started with. You felt tension. You felt a trade-off between two opposing answers. You didn't want to choose either because neither of them is good enough, or by choosing one over the other, you're giving too much up. And so there's a subjective dimension where you say, I have a higher bar for the answer. I need my answer to look like this. And right now, all the answers are down here. And so a great choice is one that resolves some of that tension and creates new value for you. And it might be a little bit of new value, or it might be a huge amount of new value, depending on the nature of the problem and how far you get right now in seeking to solve it.
Interesting. And I think, and this is, by the way, from the personal experience that what I have seen, great comes on a hindsight, right? So if I look back, certain things, I took 10 decisions and probably 3 of them, maybe none of them actually ended up becoming great. So from that perspective, now if I'm looking forward about sort of what has been your finding and sort of from these sort of way to figure out the better way to resolve a conflict and get to a solution, how do you, like, is there any percentage of success that you have seen? Hey, X questions or X decisions, probably that percentage would ended up becoming somewhat favorable in your direction to be calling it great.
Yeah, so we haven't done a quantitative analysis, and you can imagine why that's the case, right? It is really hard to know, did the results of this turn out the way that they did because of this decision? Could another decision have been better? Or are there outside variables that have caused that outcome regardless of my decision? And so the only way we can really know is for the individual to assess, right? Here were my alternatives, and here's what I believe would have happened in those two scenarios, and here's what I chose to do. Here's how I believed it created new value. Here's my explanation of the new value that I saw it creating relative to where I began, and why I believe that it has been a better answer than if I just chose it. You will never know for sure in a complex social system like the modern corporation. I think it's a little foolhardy to try. I suspect there are folks out there who know a lot more about statistics than I do, who are rolling their eyes and saying, "Of course you can figure this out. It's just a sort of problem of experimental design," and that's probably true. But we are much more interested in the enablement of people, and so we spend more of our time training and giving people these tools, and then they come back and say, "This has been impactful in the following way." And sometimes it's very specifically about a given decision, but more often it's about them in the world. That this methodology or this approach, they feel just makes them a more effective leader or helps them see the world differently. I was chatting with a high school principal who said, this has changed my life. It's changed how I engage with my family. It's changed all the work that I do. It's changed how I see what my job is. And so that's harder, again, to quantify, but I think really meaningful.
Interesting. No, I think well said. And I definitely agree with you. So what have been some of your personal examples where you have seen this conflict or this resolution happening? Like, what are some of the stories and some of the examples you could share? Yeah,
so there are many different examples, some of which we get into in great detail in the book. So we talk about Jorgen Vignustrup at Lego, just very quickly. So this is about the origin of the Lego movie, and Rogers worked with Lego for a number of years on the strategy front. And when Jorgen told him this story, he immediately ran back to me and said, it's an integrative solution. It's an integrative, Jorgen did this. And so essentially this was the context. So Lego makes the little plastic bricks, right? That's the core business that, minifigures and bricks. They don't do anything else. They don't have other toy lines or other brands. They're Lego. They've been Lego for their entire existence. But they do partner, and they have for a long time. So Lucasfilm would come along and say, we want to make a video game with your little minifigs. And so we'll do a licensing agreement. You can sell Luke Skywalker minifigs, and we'll do a video game featuring that little minifig, and kids will love it, and we'll both make a lot of money. And that's been great. And they have done that for many, many years. But of course, before long, someone inside Lego said, we're a great brand all on our own. We don't actually have to rely on these other entertainment brands. What if we actually wanted to do our own branded entertainment? What if we wanted to make a movie that was just about Lego? And when you think about how to do that, there is at the heart a trade-off that is really hard to reconcile, right? Which is, we're a great big corporate brand and we want to make a great movie. Typically, when we think about what a great movie looks like, it is spearheaded by an artistic visionary who's passionate about the subject, who loves what they're doing, who feels and owns that film, has total creative control. And that's what we think of as producing a great movie. On the other hand, if you think about it from Lego's perspective, they don't want to give some outsider total and complete creative control of a movie about Lego. It's their brand. The single most important thing to Lego is that their brand is protected. And so they would want to keep the creative control for themselves. They'd want sign off on the script. They'd want to make sure that every aspect was true to the brand and took care of the company and all of those things. And so they tried a couple of times and not succeeded. So there's a movie before the famous Lego movie that is a Lego branded film called The Adventures of Clutch Powers, which most people haven't heard of. Because they really did default to Lego needs to be in charge. We need total creative control. It has to be brand true and earnest and all of the things that we associate with Lego. And it is so earnest that one of the main characters is named after the chairman of the board of Lego. Right. Like, it tells you enough about, it's not an edgy film. Let's just say that. Right. Not successful artistically and not successful financially. And it doesn't do anything to help the Lego brand. In fact, you could say it diminishes it. So when they are approached by a major studio to say, let's do a large scale, big Lego movie, Jorgen is confronted with this choice. Like, do I insist that we have creative control and just try to do it better? Or do I acknowledge there's nothing I can do? The most important thing is giving total creative control to the talent so that they will make a really, really good movie. But I just have to trust that they will be good to us and not kind of screw over the Lego brand. There's no real good point between those extremes. Like, you could try to create a really sophisticated contract, but he recognized pretty quickly that to get anyone worth having to make this film, you had to give them creative control. There is no good filmmaker who's going to say, absolutely, a big corporate brand can sign off on my script. And so he said, if they have to have creative control, is there a new way of thinking about the problem such that I can still have meaningful influence? I can still ensure that they take care of Lego. What could I do? How could I think about it so that ultimately the people who care most about Lego will be protected? And what he did was say, Lord and Miller, filmmakers, you get creative control, off you go do something creative. But before you do, you need to come and spend meaningful time, not with me, not with my board of directors, not with my senior leaders, but with the people who love Lego the most in the world. And you're nodding, you know who that is, right? It's little kids. Little kids love Lego. It is a passion for them. And he said, if you come and you play with kids, like you play Lego and you watch them and you talk to them and you engage with them and you come spend time at conventions. I didn't know this. There are conventions for Lego of adult superfans who love, love, love Lego beyond all. He believed that if they did that, they would fall in love with Lego, right? They would fall in love with it as a child does. They would recognize the responsibility they had, not to Lego the company, but to Lego the idea, Lego as a kid loves it. And so that was the deal was, we will be totally confident that they will take care of Lego because they don't want to disappoint the 5-year-olds, right? And that turned out to be extraordinarily successful. Lord and Miller had creative control of the film, but Lego felt confident that it was going to be something that took care of the brand. And it turned out, to be massively successful.
Wow. I think that's a fascinating story, by the way, and thank you for sharing that, and love to read more of it in the book. So let's talk about, in your experience, in your journey, like what are some of your personal hurdles where you actually have seen this great choice mindset or landscape happening? If you can share some of the stories there.
Yeah, so this is a really good question. I think for me, integrated thinking, yes, is a distinct process that you can get a team together, put a problem in front of you and work on it. And I've done that with lots of different groups, with lots of different challenges. But for me, the most meaningful impacts of integrative thinking is integrative thinking not just as a process, but as a way of being in the world. And as I said, I started out as a relatively brittle MBA student who believed I have the right answer. Anyone who disagrees with me is wrong and therefore not worth listening to. Maybe they're not as smart as me, or maybe they're not as understanding of the world, or maybe they have an evil agenda of some kind, right? And so I would dismiss them completely and utterly out of hand. And so for me, integrative thinking, just the acknowledgement that there is value in opposition, that there is value not in arguing, but in understanding. Seeking to understand what I believe and why I believe it, what you believe and why you believe it, in hopes that we can find an answer that is something other than where we started, has changed how I engage in conversations, and it's changed my sort of instant gut reaction. I love, I'm on Twitter and I really enjoy Twitter. And there are lots of times where I want to reply really quickly to something someone has tweeted. And I'm like, all right, what don't I see? How are they thinking about this? Try to see what might be valuable in that view. And just that check, that slowing down, I think makes me more likely to engage with ideas longer and learn than I might have been otherwise.
Interesting. So I think one others area I want your perspective on. I think you talked about storytelling, importance of storytelling, and sort of in getting the thought across, and you spoke about the applicability, right? So if you see on the paradigm, storytelling, obviously it slows things down. Sort of it requires a lot of consortium of thoughts coming together and then getting things done. But applicability is getting something quick out that I can really use. So from your sort of vantage point, what is the balance between the two? Like, how could we balance the storytelling and the applicability when it comes to sort of decision making?
So I'm a huge believer in storytelling. I think that storytelling is how human beings learn, right? There's a reason why every religion teaches through parable, right? That those stories are intended to be memorable and visceral and instructive. And I think what we tend to see now, we have sort of this tyranny of PowerPoint where you just come in and I'm going to show you all the data, and the data is going to be abundantly clear, and you will come to the right conclusion and the right answer on the basis of the brilliance of the data, as if the data is somehow unbiased and can only be interpreted in one way. And I suspect you've been in meetings where it was abundantly clear to you what the data said, and some person sitting across from you was like, well, no, it shows the opposite of that. I actually would make the opposite recommendation on the basis of the data. And so I think that the greatest tool for data scientists, for folks who are doing work in that area, is to say, how do I make the data tell a story? How do I help it become more human? Tie it to a narrative that is understandable to people who are not me, so that we can have a conversation about it without sort of debating the decimal point.
Interesting. And what's your perspective on the design thinking aspect of this? Like, so where does that fit into this choice paradigm?
So we think of of design thinking as being kind of a sister discipline to integrative thinking. They're both problem-solving tools, ways of coming at problems. I think that design thinking is extraordinarily great when you have a particular innovation challenge. It might not be an either or choice, but you have a space you want to explore or an area of opportunity. And the two biggest contributions, in my view, of design thinking to the discourse around innovation, the first, starting with the deep, meaningful understanding of the user. I think that that's extraordinarily valuable and is implicit, I think, in integrative thinking. But the second big contribution of design thinking to the world of innovation is in the idea of rapid prototyping. So how do we take early rough ideas, build them out in whatever way we can imagine building it. So it can be a drawing, it can be a 3D model, it can be a role play, it can be whatever, and get that in front of people much more quickly than we would normally be comfortable, get their feedback and iterate and do it again and do it again and do it again. I think it's an extraordinarily key contribution of design thinking that we see echoes of in things like Agile and other innovation forms. And it is something that we took very closely to heart. For a long time, when we talked about integrative thinking, we sort of said, you take the opposing models and you seek to understand them. You try to figure out what you want to take. You create possibilities for better answers, and then you were done. And design thinking really pushed us to think differently about that and say, new ideas are amongst the most fragile things in the world, right? If it hasn't happened before, you haven't proven in advance that it can work. If it's truly new, there's no proof. And so it's really easy to say, let's just keep doing what we're doing. That feels risky. That feels untried. And if you can't prove it, I don't want to do it. And so what we said is, in integrative thinking, we wanted to embrace the spirit of rapid prototyping. So we added a stage at the end of the process that said, take these possibilities, these ideas of a better answer, and actually do some testing. And we say, for each of the ideas, ask yourself and your team what would have to be true for that to be a great answer. What would have to be true about our industry and our competitors and our customers and us? What would have to be true for that to be a meaningfully better answer than where we are today? And how would we know if those are true? What tests could be run? What analysis? What data do we already have that we just have to look at differently? And so that was a huge influence for us from design thinking. We think it's something you should add to any process, whether you're actively engaged in design thinking or not. If you have a new idea, if you're thinking about something that hasn't been tried before, whether, as I say, it comes out of a Lean Six Sigma process or a design thinking process, asking yourself, how can we do that very early, very rapid testing before we move to full scale, before we even move to a big pilot, I think makes you more likely to be successful rather than less.
Interesting. Pretty cool. I think I appreciate you sharing that. So one thing that I was thinking about when you were talking about, I think in one of the previous conversation about this integrative thinking approach of taking ideas from as many sort of stakeholders as possible. I think one thing that comes to my mind is and that I'm wearing my consultant hat. So every industry is different, right? So every industry has varying level of stakeholder that take part in this conversation to get to decision making. And in many aspects, it just slows down the decision making process, the more sort of stakeholders you have. So from your vantage point, are there any some industries that are more favorable towards this creative creating great choices framework, or some industries which are really bad, or at least they have a long sort of road to cross on that? So what's your vantage point on that?
Yeah, so I would say for me, it's less about industry and more about context within that industry. So I think it's applicable across industry, but it's not for every problem. So let's imagine you have a problem to be solved. You have a very short amount of time to solve it in. Whatever answer you launch is something you can easily step back from. It's not going to cost you a lot. And you have an answer you already kind of like. Like, it's not perfect, but you kind of like it. Go and do it. Like, get it out there, execute, and learn in market. Integrative thinking is really for those situations where the answers on the table aren't good enough. The answers on the table don't give you what you need. Where if you were to start trying to do it, it feels like it would be hard to come back and change. It would be extraordinarily expensive to try it, all those reasons, right? And so the way I think about it is, I'm not sure integrative thinking is slower than other decision-making methodologies if you take into account the time from when you start to effective action, right? So sometimes we say there's not enough time to be inclusive and really think about it and come to a great answer. We just have to accept what we've got. We know it's not very good. And just everyone around here, I know you don't agree with this answer, but just do it. That's dangerous, right? I know you don't agree with it, but just do it is a recipe for undermining, foot dragging, second guessing. And so it actually takes way longer for that idea to get implemented. And very often those ideas fail because we didn't invest the time in figuring out whether there was a better answer, engaging those stakeholders. And so I think we sometimes fool ourselves that if we don't engage the stakeholders, that it will be faster and easier. And those are the kinds of solutions that wind up biting us in the butt at the end.
Interesting. So basically, what you're recommending is that we should as an organization build a framework to find a consensus quickly because that's relevant instead of sort of, as you said, that if leadership say, hey, because I'm saying, just do it. So from that perspective, is that right?
Well, we believe integrative thinking doesn't have to take a huge amount of time. It can be done in an afternoon or a day on a given problem, but it's also a social process that enables you to bring more folks into the conversation and have them feel ownership of the solution. And sometimes you just have to boss things in. I don't want to pretend the world is perfect, but I think we default to that way more often than is optimal.
Interesting. And I think other area I find interesting nowadays is like previously I used to remember that I used to go to an office, and that office, like the entire towns were created around those great businesses as they were expanding. But nowadays, because of thanks to internet and sort of these remote tooling and working sort of platforms, someone can in the village in Tuscany with a laptop could be as productive as a neighboring guy going to a Manhattan office. So how is that sort of changing landscape of globalism in which sort of we are many of the companies are actually having these workers working from home and all that? How difficult does that make getting a consensus when you're not? Because if we are physically at a room, I can see their facial expression, I can see your angst, I can see the temperature in the room, and at least get somewhere with that. But I think now being on Skype, hardly anything. It's like most of these cues are just dropped because I'm not seeing majority of the conversation that is happening between us, which is probably not verbal and at least this particular square landscape. So what's the result? Like what has been your observation on that?
So I often say integrative thinking is an individual skill and a team sport. So I do believe that you will do better if you have a group of folks that you're working with. That said, I think technology is ever increasing. So I would never have said you could do consensus building or integrative thinking exercises on the phone, right? There's just not enough resolution there. Over the last year or so, I've done a number in whether it's GoToMeeting or WebExes where people are in different parts of the world. As long as we can see each other and we are singing from the same song sheet in terms of we're going through a process together, we are working through this methodology of integrative thinking. It's actually interesting to me that you can get quite a lot of value, even if you're not physically in the same room. And as tools get better and better and better, as we increasingly get to a place where we can engage almost as if we were in the same room, I'm really optimistic about what's possible.
Interesting. And what's your perception on the future of work as it so from I think from your Martin Institute, you're actually having a good vantage point on whatever is happening around and how sort of political situation is happening, how the technology is getting us getting in our nerves when we talk about, say, tribalism and whatnot. So and with that in mind and this book in mind, what do you think is happening to the future of work and worker and workplace? Whatever you can share on that.
Yeah, it is a fascinating time to think about the future of work. Globalization has changed the composition of what work looks like in North America very dramatically. Technology, similarly, many jobs that used to exist no longer exist. And the way we tend to think about the future of work from our perspective is we know that there are ways of thinking about work that fall into two broad categories, right? So there is very routine jobs with very little human judgment, independent decision making. And then there are more creative jobs, knowledge work, where there's a lot of independent judgment and decision making, where there's a huge benefit to a human doing it versus not. There are a number of jobs that we're going to see in the routine category be replaced with machines, but not all. The largest dominant sector of routine work is actually in the service sector. Some of those jobs will go away, but not all of them, and certainly not quickly. And those jobs, unfortunately, are very low pay, extremely hard emotionally, physically. Often there's shift work, unpredictability, no benefits, and they are the majority of jobs. The majority of jobs in North America still are routine intensive versus creative jobs. Creative jobs are not growing quickly enough. So our question is, how might we take jobs like a frontline retail clerk, or someone who works in a Walmart, and turn that from a bad job, low paid, low independent judgment and decision making, into a good job? Not just by paying them more, but by redesigning the work so that they deserve to earn more, right? So I think it's great that we're talking about raising the minimum wage, but what I would love and even more is to say, how do you take a job where we have traditionally asked people to turn off their brain and turn it into a job where their brain is an asset? There's just not going to be enough work, designing space shuttles for us to, and maybe even machines would be better at designing space shuttles than people anyway, eventually. So how do we take what makes us human, the true value of that, which is around empathy and creativity, and bring that into more kinds of work? And if we can do that, do we have a shot at a better society?
Interesting. And by the way, beautifully said, and thank you so much for sharing that. So let's talk about, do you have any cases where you have seen the integrative thinking fail? Like, do you see where you said, okay, it doesn't weigh the way, we never anticipated the way it turned out to be? Do you have any such those quotable examples?
Absolutely. So the most common form is we start with the two opposing answers. We spend a bunch of time thinking about them and then say, is there a better answer? And there's nothing forthcoming right now. The insight isn't there. We're not ready. We don't see something. And so we say, all right, well, if we aren't able to come up with a better answer in this instance, which of the existing options do we want to choose, right? So that's one form of failure. We still think that there's value in using integrative thinking because at the very least you understand the options better than you did. Are there cases where someone used integrative thinking, came up with an answer that they thought was great, tried it in the marketplace and it failed? I think that's probably likely to be the case. I haven't had a lot of people come tell me that, because why would they want to tell me that they tried it and it failed? But I think the important thing is that a lot of folks say, it failed that time, but that doesn't mean that it will fail next time or the next time. The world is complex. You can't control all the variables. It was a good idea, but it was ahead of its time, or it was a good idea, but the competitors move more quickly, whatever else it might be. So I have no doubt there are examples of failure, but I don't have a lot of stories to share from that perspective.
Interesting. And so regarding this book, like who are the typical reader that you anticipated when you start writing this book? Who are the target readers do you expect this book to read?
So we talked about it as being a leader's guide for integrative thinking. And so the obvious target there is definitely business leaders of all types. So folks in organizations who are accountable for making decisions, from CEO to managing director to people leaders who are just sort of starting down that leadership journey. But we've also heard from a lot of high school principals who see it as useful, from kids who see it as useful in just how they're making decisions about their lives. So We think it's a pretty broad audience of anyone who wishes that they had another tool for their tool belt. So we have lots of great decision-making tools we learn in school that we already have. And then this is an additional one that you can turn to when some of those traditional methodologies fail you.
Interesting. And so, and what is the thing that you want the readers to take away from the book? Like, what are some of the thoughts?
So, one, I want them to understand that it's possible. So, if the 7-year-olds can do it, and A.G. Lafley can do it, then there's a huge range of opportunity between those two things for each of us. And for me, it's at least in part about changing the conversation. I'm really disheartened to see the political discourse in particular, in which anyone who disagrees with us is one of stupid or evil, or sometimes both. And so I don't have to pay attention to you. I don't have to listen. My job is to make fun of you. And there are certainly people in the world who fall into the categories of stupid or evil. There are folks with whom I strenuously disagree, even despite my integrative thinking training. But I worry that without at least an intention to seek to understand each other, we move further and further and further and further apart. And I truly do worry for the future of our nations, for the future of society, which sounds hyperbolic. But when you go on Facebook and you watch how people speak to each other, it can be really scary. And so I want to provide some hope that there are other ways of engaging with people who disagree with us that are more productive and more helpful and less scary.
Interesting. And what's the future of this conversation? Like, so I think definitely this books like these create a dialogue, create a community, create a conversation around sort of creating great choices and all. Like, from your design of this book, like what is the future of this book?
So we definitely have the book out there and are hoping that people will use it and work on things in their organizations and tell us about it, get back to us so that we can figure out ways to share those stories with other people. We're seeking to employ some of the integrative thinking work on questions of democratic capitalism. So you'll see more of the theme and work that comes out of the Martin Prosperity Institute over the next year or so. So those are the two big vectors that we're focused on right now.
Interesting. So that brings us at the end of this conversation around the book. So I definitely want to spend some time on your background, if you don't mind. So I think one thing definitely I want to know in your journey through your academia and through your research, what are some of the key tenets of your success? If you tame it, like what are some of the factors that you think has helped you achieve what you've achieved?
Well, it's a great question. So one, I had a belief when I was younger that I needed to know exactly what I was going to do and have a path. And the most cool, fun, and rewarding things I've done have been when I took a leap without really knowing what it would lead to. Someone would put an opportunity in front of me and I'd say, well, that sounds fun or hard or interesting. I don't know where it leads, but I'll try it. That tends to be sort of the path that has worked more for me than planning this move, then that move, then that move. So I think that's one thing. I think the second, this is something I learned from Roger. He talks about being relentlessly useful. So, whatever you're doing, whoever you're working with, whatever the situation is, having in your own mind that your job is to be helpful to that person. And more in how they would see it as helpful as opposed to you deciding what would be helpful, right? So this notion of relentless utility, trying to figure out how I can be helpful to people, has been a theme through my work, and I think transformative for what is possible. So that's my big insight: is be relentlessly useful regardless of the context or situation.
Beautifully said. So how about any favorite read or favorite books that you have read that you want to share with our viewers and listeners?
So, I mean, Pride and Prejudice is still the best book, but I assume you don't mean that. Although I will say this, I have a great colleague here at Rotman named Maya Dijik, who's a psychologist, and she's done work on empathy, and she's found that when we read fiction, we boost our ability to have empathy for other people. So we should all read more fiction, and that's everything from comic books to Pride and Prejudice. So do that. In terms of business books, I think the ones that have had the most influence on me, Danny Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow. It's fantastic. If you haven't yet read it, most of you have, but if you haven't, it's great. Adam Grant just wrote Originals. Before that, Give or Take. Both of those are excellent. And apropos of our conversation about how we see each other and how we communicate, Jonathan Haidt at NYU wrote a book a couple of years ago called The Righteous Mind, which talks about how we reason and how we come to our conclusions, and helps explain a bit about the divide between left and right, that I think is really, really useful. And the last one sounds super nerdy, but it's really interesting. A MIT operations professor named Zeynep Ton does work with us on the future of work. She's phenomenal. And she wrote a book called The Good Job Strategy. She studies a lot of the jobs we were talking about, so low-cost retail. And she studies companies that have broken the trade-off, so organizations like Costco and Trader Joe's that offer great jobs and great wages and make a ton of money. And she explores operationally how they do that. And so if you have influence, whether it's retail or just any service industry, I think there are lessons that can be learned from her work. So those would be the big ones I would recommend.
Beautiful set. And again, Jennifer, thank you so much. We are almost at the last end of the conversation. So last but not the least, so if you want listeners and viewers to take away something from this conversation, what would that be? What would be your closing remark for our viewers and listeners?
So for me, it's fairly fundamental. Very often when we're faced with a tough either a choice in front of us, or I believe one thing and you believe the other, we frame it really simply that I've got to choose, I've got to find the single right answer, I've got to move forward. And what I would want people to take away is just the notion that it may be worth trying however much time you've got, 5 minutes, an hour, however long, to see the real value in each of the opposing perspectives, to really seek to fall in love with them and understand what it is uniquely that they bring, how there is value in them, and then to use those insights to imagine a better answer, to seek a world that is different than it is today.
With that, Jennifer, thank you so much for being really candid with your opinions and spending a generous amount of time with our listeners and viewers, sharing your journey through this book, sharing what the perspective. And I think I am definitely thankful to you on behalf of my community, to folks at Martin Prosperity Institute, for doing a research on such a critical topic. And I think we are all sort of, as I said before, we are all facing this problem as an organization, as an individual, as a society. So someone has to do a research. So I definitely do appreciate you spending time there, and loving to have you back on the podcast sometime in future with more work from Prosperity Institute that you want to share. And thank you so much for your time, and wish you nothing but success in your journey in this institute, and hope you help us solve the society.
Well, thank you. It was an absolute pleasure to be on. Anytime, I'd be happy to do it again.
Thank you.
I thought I was sick of home, but actually I was homesick. Never really knew that I would have to grow up so quick. I'm so uncomfortable, don't know anybody here. Just a couple dudes that I met once, that's it. And I go into the booth feeling nervous. Got butterflies in my stomach like I'm so worthless. Is the mic on? I don't know how to work this. Inside I'm breaking down, I hope I'm not up on the